Today we're talking with Margarita Quihuis, a dear friend, colleague, somebody I've known for a very long time.
Mhm.
Margarita, you have been very generous in coming to San Francisco State. You know our students.
Mhm.
You've spoken to many of my classes, taken time from your very busy schedule, and have been very forthcoming. As I've mentioned to you, we're focusing on social justice and trying to integrate that into our curriculum this semester. Everything is virtual, so the students will see this as a virtual presentation and do an assignment from it. So I'd like us, rather than focusing on your very technical career as an entrepreneur, as a technology person, a behavioral technology fellow at Stanford, we could go on. People can check out your credentials. Um, I'd like us to focus on this subject area of social justice. And since you have been involved with this from many perspectives as a Latina or Latinx, however, or Hispanic, however it's right to refer to that, as an Indian American, Native American Indian in your background, and as a woman who has been in male career paths, you have experienced the flip side of discrimination or stereotyping in your whole life. So the discussion about social justice is a very personal one for you, and one that you have a wonderful perspective through your whole life. So let's start with you talking about how you view or would define social justice for this era.
No, I think that is the question. Certainly, it was the question of the summer, especially I was looking at companies decide that they needed to respond to Black Lives Matter and say, like, okay, how do we integrate social justice? How do we have a more just culture, a more inclusive culture, a more equitable culture? And as I examined the landscape, people were stalled on both sides. You saw whites who said, "Okay, I want to be woke. What should I be reading? How should we talk? How should I respond? How should I listen?" And then on the other side, saying like, "Okay, we want this justice." And I actually did this exercise with my students and with my PeaceX entrepreneurs this summer. I said, "Okay, let us imagine what a just, inclusive, and equitable culture looks like in your organization. I'm not going to boil the ocean and say the United States or the world, but like in your company, in your organization, what does that look like behaviorally, not attitudinally, because we're walking around with all these ideas in our head, but I don't, you probably have 10,000 thoughts in your head, but I don't know what they are, right? None of my business. All I know is the moment that we interact with each other, right? That's when things happen, when people are interacting with each other. So it's very much a behavioral lens. And it was interesting because everybody was stuck. I couldn't get any kind of a coherent answer. So I was asking my students who are they're multicultural, black, brown, Desi, everything, right? Minority of Caucasian students. I said, okay, what would a just and equitable culture look like to you? And this young African American athlete said, so what we should do is we should go out to lunch with each other, or we should smile to each other. And I'm going like, okay, so is that really sufficient? Do you feel like you will be seen, heard, and understood if someone takes you out to lunch or you go out for drinks with your coworkers? Because let me tell you, that's happening right now, and it's not enough, right? It's not enough. So there is like, I almost feel like, you know how there's this Bloom's taxonomy of critical thinking and critical questions, right? So you level 0 to level 10, and you get more sophisticated in terms of your critical thinking. We almost need like a Bloom's taxonomy of what social justice looks like. So level 1, level 0 is that when we walk, when we see each other, we make eye contact. Okay, yay. And then level 2 is this, and then level 3 is this. But social justice is a term that's thrown around so much, and we do not have a common definition. And because we have that Princess Bride moment of, I don't think that word thinks is what what means what you think it means, and we don't have this common definition. That's why we haven't been able to move forward, because we actually don't know what the hell we're talking about when we say we want social justice. We know it at an abstract level, but not in a tangible, every day, what are you doing on Monday morning that's different than what you were doing before level. And so until we can get down to that granular level, we're going to be stuck in this abstract. It kind of reminds me of the old beer commercial, you know, the taste great, less filling. They're arguing, and you're going like, that's a nonsensical argument. So until we can get to something very, very specific that we can work on, we're not going to make progress on social justice. What I think aspirationally people are looking for, certainly people of color, is that we just want to have a shot at it. It's sort of like Hamilton, you know, like I want to have a shot at success. I don't want to throw away my shot. I want to have a fair chance. And if I make it or not, it's on me. But not being able to actually self-actualize and realize your dreams is crushing. And if you've been in an environment or in a context where um, you didn't have everything stacked against you, that's hard to comprehend because it's invisible. It's hard to comprehend the advantages you have unless you can do some sort of inventory. And certainly the older I've gotten, I can look back and say, oh, I had this lined up for me. Oh, this wasn't lined up for me. And sometimes we hit the, certainly as a woman, as a woman of color, I don't know the opportunities that were denied me because of that, because they just never came my way. You know, so it's hard to measure that void. And I don't have any assumptions or entitlement like, oh, I should have gotten that, because I came from a place and where I've exceeded the expectations of the people who raised me and schooled me. Just whatever I've done, given from where I started. So I don't feel like, well, I applied to Yale and I was entitled to go there, and if someone took that slot, it was mine. That just never came to mind.
So
So
Marguerite,
it's just a different
if I
mindset.
may, let me drill a little bit down on this, because you have had so many experiences that you've been able to self-reflect on. Can you give me an experience where social justice was not done for you, and an experience where you felt social justice was done for you, to give us some anecdote that matches what you've just said?
So I remember a couple of times in my career, certainly in my 20s and my 30s, um, I had I was working for a material science company in Menlo Park that was very esteemed and respected and so on. And I remember this manager taking me out to lunch. You know, that very avuncular kind of, I'm going to take you out, you know, we're going to talk about stuff. And it was like, you're talented, you're smart, and blah, blah, blah. But but you're not going to go anywhere here.
Hmm.
And I went like, oh, okay. Well, you know, thank you for telling me that I'm talented and smart, but I'm not going to go very far. And then when I worked for an esteemed design company in Palo Alto, it was the same thing. It was actually like the chief of staff who took me out to lunch. He goes, your resume is amazing, you're accomplished, blah, blah, blah. But let me tell you, they're going to hate you here. And in both those instances, I just took it as like, oh, well, that's just the way it is. And they would say things like, but perhaps in your daughter's time or your granddaughter's time, things
Wow.
will be different.
Wow.
And I just had to, you know, and they pick up the tab for lunch and thank you very much, right? It wasn't until recent years, and actually it wasn't until this summer when I was having a conversation with my husband, because his company is going through like, what do we do about Black Lives Matters? We want to be equitable, blah, blah, blah. And they were stuck. And I said, look, this happened to me, and though it didn't occur to me until 2020 that those white men who had positions of power in the organization, you know, they were executives, did not think I was worth it. They didn't say to say, you know what, you're smart, you're talented, you have all this potential, and I'm going to clear the way so you can get the opportunities that you should have to realize your potential. They didn't say that. They said, you're smart, you're talented, here's the wall, I'm so sorry, and you just have to live with it. They did not think I was worth the political expenditure, the social expenditure to stand up and say, you know what, this is not right. Or we have really talented young people, and it's in our business interest to cultivate their talent so they can do awesome things for us. I
Interesting.
said, and I said, they were not allies,
They were
and they
not
did not
they
feel
were not champions. They were not
at
champions.
all. And they
Organ-
didn't, and here's the thing, the status quo was just fine for them. They're saying, yeah, there's no opportunity for you. Doesn't matter how smart you are. And by the way, I'm not going to lift a finger to change the system either.
So have you, that's a great example. And I know that you have many others. Um, but have you had the opposite experience
Uh,
where you can say, this may not happen all the time, but I can see what the other side looks like of where social justice exists for me?
no, not really. To be honest, the when I've gotten the opportunities, there have been strings attached,
Wow. So we're
and
definitely not there.
no, not at all.
So
I
how do you,
mean, for
let's continue on how you view social justice. You've talked about it from a career standpoint.
Mhm,
Um, you have been engaged in many nonprofits with women organizations,
mhm.
with the Hispanic Net, in which you talked about the male in Hispanic Net that made it
Yeah.
difficult for you as a female. So you've got a lot of ways to look at this, not just from a ethnic standpoint, but from a male female standpoint, et cetera. Um, how does social justice work in all the realms of one's life, not simply at work? And how could you define that for us too? Because social is a big part of our lives, as I'm
Mhm.
sure you know.
Yeah. And to be clear, most of us spend our time at work. So work has a huge, it's, in the 24 hours that we have in our day, when you exclude the sleeping and the cooking dinner and putting your kids to bed and the homework, you're at work. It dominates. Um, and certainly what I notice is that like I don't have a lot of social interactions.
Mm,
And I'm in this funny in between age in Silicon Valley, because the women who have had successful careers in Silicon Valley are 10 years younger than me.
yeah.
And the women who are banging their head against the wall and the ceiling were 10 years older than me. And so I'm in this weird in between where I was working with women to open those doors, and we were, you know, pushing to open the door, but we weren't the beneficiaries of that effort. We were just cracking the door open, and the younger generation of women walk through it.
So let me
Um,
ask this totally because I'm fascinated. Could you define social justice for women differently than social justice for Latinos?
oh,
Differently?
absolutely.
And
Um,
age group, is there a way for us, rather than look at everything as social justice, to look
yeah.
at those permutations from your life experience of
I mean, there's,
what is social
I mean,
justice like for women?
I, I mean, there's no question that you have to look at the intersectionality of everything, right? So when I was working in terms of promoting women in technology, it was primarily advantaged white women, full stop, with Stanford and Harvard business school degrees. They were not disadvantaged in the whole scheme of things. I mean, there's definitely a pecking order. They're not white men, but they were white women, right? And so they were going to go through that door first. Um, Even 20 years later, after I launched the first technology incubator for women, it's still around, doing really, really great. Hispanic women are still a rounding error. you know, was still a rarity. Black women are still fighting for it. Asian women are, if you think about the hierarchy, and there is a caste system in this country, and there's a caste system in Silicon Valley. So is white people, there's Asian people, there's a South Asian people, and then there's everybody else.
Wow.
And those three categories operate in the elite. And Hispanics and Blacks, even after 25 years, still fighting, and we're still a single percentage point, single digit, you know, representation. And that's in technology. Hispanics, even though we're 20% of the population in the US, roughly, we're extraordinarily underrepresented in entertainment and media. And I look at everyone else going, go like, gosh, they're doing really well. I mean, I have South Asian friends, and so it's like Mindy Kaling and all. It's like fantastic, but you know what? We're still like, you know, trying to crack the door open, and everybody else is walking through. So this isn't that it's rivalrous, but the way the system is set up, it can feel that way.
Wow. Let me move on to identity. We talked about that we wanted to talk about what needs to be done for identity and understanding identity, because you don't want to erase your identity when you mix in with others, and yet you are mixed with others. So there's a different identity that our young people find with people who are like them, and then what's your identity with people who are not like you, or how
Right.
could one look at identity positively, particularly when there's so much discrimination on your identity.
Mhm.
So I don't want to look at identity as vanilla and chocolate. It's very different when you are
Right.
talking from your perspective than, say, my perspective. And then the idea of empathy, which we'll get into, that
Mhm.
how do somebody like me or others really empathize and understands in a way that's deeper than simply the words?
Right.
And how do we listen differently?
Mhm.
So let's
Yes.
start with your identity when you think about identity. And let me put another thing in here, because you have a son who is close in age to my students.
Mhm.
So what's the conversation that you have with Benjamin about this, if you've ever had it, or
Right.
how does he feel about this relative to identity and what he's facing, or does he face it at all?
Right. It's interesting because he's half Hispanic, half white.
Yeah.
And in fact, his cousins are also half Hispanic and half white. And there was an interesting breakfast conversation one time at my mom's house, and all the nephews were there. And they were talking about what it was to be multicultural. And my nephews were telling stories about how they would go visit their white grandparents, their paternal grandparents, and go to the country club. And how, at the country club, they would be trash talking about the Mexicans.
Wow.
And my nephews are light skinned. I mean, depending upon the context, they pass for white, but if you put them, Hispanics, Mexicans, we're a rainbow of colors. We go from light to dark, so they could pass for that as well. Um, and my nephew was saying, like, yeah, it's really curious because in my mind, I'm going like, you're talking about me and my mom.
Wow.
Right. And then my other nephew's going like, yeah, exactly, from my other sister. And they were all having, and I was just sitting there as a fly on the wall because they were ignoring me. And I was going, this is really interesting for these young men to talk about what it's like to live with that conflict within their family,
Wow.
where one side of the family disdains the other side of the family. And I would say, you're talking about me behind my back in front of my face. Like, you're saying these things. I don't know if you realize, but if you open me up inside, I'm half and half. Um, so that was an interesting dynamic in how they have to code switch as they move between the cultures and be a chameleon. And certainly in my growing up, because I grew up in a white community, um, and there weren't that many Hispanics, I had to learn how to not quite pass, but certainly the highest compliment that my sisters and I would get is, but you're not like the other Mexicans. And we'd say, well, what precisely do you mean by that? And it's because we didn't read as being from the hood, being from the barrio. We didn't look like cholas. We, you know, and of course we didn't, because we grew up in a white community, and so, the way you dress and the way you groom and everything is based on that context of that environment. I didn't grow up in the environment, so why would I look like that? Um, and it was interesting interacting with whites, because they just wanted to put you in that category, and if you weren't in that stereotypical category, they don't know what to do with you. And so I've always been a bit of a problem child. Like, if she was straight on Mexican Chicana Chola, we would just put her in that box. But she's not. So we don't know what to do with her. And so my thing has always been, of because I don't fit neatly in the box. Like, she's really smart. If I was white, it would be really, really obvious what to do. If I was a white guy, it would be super, super obvious what to do. Got a playbook for developing and mentoring this talent. There's no playbook for someone like me.
Since I know your history and I knew that your parents dropped you off at Stanford,
Yeah, yeah,
you
exactly.
talk about, a fish out of water. You, from your own story, not only had to adjust to that academic environment, but from a cultural, socioeconomic, every which way, what did your identity feel like? Because you were the same age as my students when you made
Mhm.
a huge transition from coming from a home in which you were the first person to go to college, and then you're going to Stanford of all things. What kind of
Well,
an identity crisis was that?
the thing is, I didn't know anything about Stanford. I applied because I liked their brochure, and I only had enough money to apply to 3 schools, and 2 of them were on the East Coast. And I got into all 3, and my dad said, "You're not going to the East Coast; it's too racist. So you're going to stay in California." And I go, "Okay, so I guess I'll go to Stanford, wherever that is. It's in this place called Palo Alto." Um, I remember talking to Al Camarillo, a Chicano studies professor at Stanford, because I felt this huge weight on me. And I remember my Aunt Raquel used to say to us when we were young, "Don't be a disgrace to the race," right? Don't be a disgrace to the race. Because we were in that in between space, hyper aware that, like, my white high school teachers and all the, like, I was like the data point of, an academically successful Mexican American girl, right? And so this notion of representation was very deep within me and my sisters. Like, when we interact with people, we will probably be one of the rare interactions that they have with someone like us. So you better stand up straight, and you better be dressed well, and the whole thing, right? Because that interaction matters, right? They have to have a good experience of you, because if they don't, it kind of ruins it for everybody. And so I felt that very heavy, responsibility of having to represent the entire raza. And it's like, oh, and I remember having this conversation with Al Camarillo, and he said, "Margarita, it's not your responsibility. You do not have to do this.
Mhm.
You do not have to shoulder the entire weight of having to represent for everybody. You you don't have to be the spokesperson, although you end up, being that, whether or not you want to. And certainly tokenism is a real thing. And as you progress, there is that element of, like, I even get it now. It's like, your moment is now. You're a woman, you're Hispanic, you're Native American, you should see. And I go, I can bring some perspectives and lived experiences that can add to the mix. But I had this epiphany in the summer. It's like, oh, I've been a token. And what happens when you're trying to crack open the door and you're saying, like, okay, got the door open, I'll take this opportunity, not realizing how the opportunity can be poisoned in some ways, because it's like they're going like, all right, we got the one, done.
Wow.
I don't need to do anything more, right? You're the one and done. Um, and so you have this illusion of breaking ground, but then you look back and you realize there's no one behind you.
Wow. When you say no one behind you, meaning that people have not really accepted you, or they're not others who are with you?
There are no, the admission was, the ticket was just for one,
Got it.
right? It's not like that created a path for others to be able to fill that pipeline,
Right.
because the pipeline is actually a cocktail straw. It's it's
You know,
really skinny.
when you've presented your story, and I wish we had the time, which we don't, for your incredible life journey, you always said, fake it until you make it. And that was
Yeah.
kind of how you did that as a woman. You did it as a Mexican American. You did it as an Indian American. You did it in so many, somebody who, went into engineering for all kinds of reasons that had nothing to do with your interest in engineering. I could go on and on of how what does that mean to you now? Fake it until you make it. And in terms of your identity, let's focus on,
Uh,
does that mean that you fake it until you feel comfortable with people who may look at you as a token, or how does that?
well, so the good news is I didn't realize I was token until I was 58 years old. If I hadn't realized it earlier, I probably would have freaked out, but I didn't know. So the good news sometimes is it can be very helpful to be oblivious to these things and not be aware. Just not be aware. You're just kind of like, you're you doing you, right? And you just sort of power through, and you're not thinking about like, oh, I didn't get that opportunity because they were racist, or oh, that did. I mean, I was not paying attention to any of that. None of it.
Yeah,
I could probably look back and say like, yeah, there's probably systemic issues and so on that prevented me from those things, but I wasn't looking for it. I don't. Okay, there's this interesting paradox, right? We know there's racism. We know there's sexism. We know the game is rigged. That is a fact. All right? You got to know that and set it aside and say, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, and bring things back into the locus of your control. Because if I think about all the systemic issues, I'd be in a corner sucking my thumb, crying of all the things I cannot do. And instead, because I was like blissfully naive or oblivious, or I don't know, I didn't have my glasses on, wasn't focused on that. I was just putting one step in front of the other, saying, like, this is what I want to do. Let me figure out how I can do it. And that's just been my modus operandi. Like, what is it that I want to do? And it's always been this pull.
right.
Um, because how do I put this? It doesn't have to be so hard. And there is no ladder, actually. There is, and people say, I need to climb the ladder of success. There's no such thing.
Right,
There
right.
really isn't.
But let's go back to your Stanford experience, and let's go back to your initial career experience. You came from a working family. When I say
Right.
working, people, when you're with
Yeah.
your family, you dress a certain way, you eat a certain way, you speak a certain way, you are yourself, so to speak.
Right.
Now you're in a cocktail party in an engineering firm. You have to dress a certain way, you have to eat a certain way, you have to hold your drink a certain way. Culturally, your identity in that culture, that's true for all of us, by the way, but in
Right.
your case, even more perhaps so, or not, you tell me, you had to make those adjustments in your identity and how you behaved.
Right.
And that feel like you were an imposter? Did that feel like, oh, this is part of the game that I have to play? It's not really my,
Uh,
did you become that
the,
person?
so what was helpful actually was growing up in a white community. Okay. So as a Hispanic, imagine that I was an anthropologist studying the indigenous people of this little bedroom community in San Diego, right? And so I was constantly like, okay, what are they doing? What, So I have studied you as a species. I know you better than you know yourself. And so going to Stanford, it was like, oh, all right. So how does it work? What do you do? Oh, that's how they dress. That's how you talk. Oh, that's how you hold your head, right? Because I had been an observer
Right.
of this culture that other than my home culture all my life. And so it was just like, oh, well, now we're leveling up. Oh, so this is how rich people work. And I had never been with people of means.
Yes.
And it was like, and okay, so when they say that money doesn't buy you happiness, I go, you know what? That's not true. Money buys you lots of things. It takes lots of worries off of your plate. And so that was interesting to learn. It's like, oh, money solves lots of problems. It really, really does. And I didn't learn that until I was in my 30s working with this venture capital firm where money was no object. Absolutely not. It's like, do you want that? Sure, you can have that. We had a someone who dealt with like the public stock and she was an administrator taking care of all that. She needed a filing cabinet in her office. And so we got Orlando, who was the interior designer, to design a mahogany cabinet for her paper.
Hmm.
Now, if it had been me, we'd gone down to Office Depot, got the $55 metal cabinet. They're done, right? No, 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 no. This thing was a thing of beauty. Custom drawers, the carpenters came. I mean, it was because for them, it was like money's no object. This is a beautifully designed office that was in an interior design magazine. We're not about to mess it up with a cheap metal cabinet.
Got it.
We're like, and I go, you can do that? Well, you know what? If you've got money, you can have anything you want. And that was really interesting to be in a context of abundance, to say, what does it feel like if you could ask for and get anything that you want? And that was a wonderful experience for me. It was wonderful because I was able to build amazing systems. I had a great team. I was able to hire the very best people. That was amazing because I go like, okay, so now I have like this my min max, right? Okay, I know how to do things on a shoestring budget and I can like, if Margarita, here's a pile of dog hair, go knit some socks. Okay, I can do that, right? But on the other hand, would say, look, here's a blank check, go do it. That was a rare experience. And I
So
was really grateful for that.
living and working in abundance from a socioeconomic standpoint in work is a different experience.